Welcome to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have back with me Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks, Jay. It's always great to be with you.
Always good to have you. You have always some great insights into what is really happening in the world, certainly an out of the mainstream view of the world. But I like to say I think that the truth is usually found not in the mainstream, which has so much to protect. So I'd like to really talk to you a bit more now about what I think is the most important geopolitical issue of our day, and that is the Ukraine and what is happening there. I'd like to have you go back, Daniel, a little bit, talk a little bit about the history of this issue. It's my understanding that up through the end of Bush 1, pretty much, the boundaries, pretty much the alignment stayed. Countries that were a part of the Soviet sphere remained trading partners, perhaps with Russia. But it wasn't until during the Clinton years that we really started to push NATO, and we started to pull in a lot of those countries that were partners of the Soviet, that were part of the Soviet Union, partners with Russia, into NATO. And that since Clinton, we've been taking more and more of these countries in under the NATO sphere, or if they haven't been accepted into NATO, at least we've made deals with the IMF or other institutions where we've gotten them into debt. Seems very much like what John Perkins has talked about, our modus operandi post-World War II. The United States has always been to try to get developing countries, third world countries, into debt so badly that we own them. Now, we continue to push and push, and this is my understanding, Daniel, that Russia started to feel, wait a minute, maybe this is going too far. All of these countries that we were trading with, that we had a relationship with, are now being pulled away from us into the NATO sphere. Would you care to comment on that? Is that your understanding? And I'm a person that doesn't follow this stuff every day like you do. But what's your understanding of the history going back post-Soviet Union?
Sure. What's interesting is that I moved to Budapest, Hungary, right as Clinton took office, and so I actually was watching on the ground what happened as the sort of romance between Hungary and NATO developed and blossomed.
Uh-huh.
And as in all of the post-communist countries, the West came in with enormous amounts of propaganda and stories of glory and wonderful military equipment. In the case of Hungary, and I'm sure it was the same with the other countries in Central Europe, the military, the budget was pretty low. The morale was pretty low. You had essentially a conscripted army, and they were not looked on very well in society. And then you had all of a sudden these people from NATO coming in and talking about the glories of the alliance, talking about joining the West, talk about modernizing their defense forces. And it must have sounded extraordinarily attractive to these guys. Mm-hmm. And I remember the first thing that happened was that the big American multinational defense contractors came into Hungary, mm-hmm. and they wanted to sell Hungary fighter jets. Mm-hmm. And it was really funny because they came and they threw a ton of money around. And I have to confess, I went to a couple of these junkets because I thought it was interesting, uh-huh. and they spared no cost. I can assure you. Uh-huh. McDonnell Douglas wanted to sell F-18As, and Lockheed Martin wanted to sell F-16s to Hungary. And the real joke there was that by the time the F-18s, which were a dual-engine plane, by the time they actually got up and working in the air, they were already outside of Hungarian airspace. So they were completely useless for actually defending Hungary. Mm-hmm. But that didn't stop them from hiring all manner of lobbyists, both Western and Eastern, to sing the glories and sing the praise of going into an enormous amount of debt when they already were saddled with all of the debt under the communists, mm-hmm. To buy all these wonderful things that they really didn't need. Mm-hmm. So it really was a lot of propaganda about the glories of the West and a lot of money being thrown around. And so I think they, that had a lot to do with it.
Mm-hmm. So Daniel, are you saying this occurred almost immediately as soon as the Soviet Union fell apart?
Certainly by the mid-1990s. It wasn't immediate. Uh-huh. As you say, there was sort of a holding period where these things weren't as set in stone. They had aspirations of joining NATO, these countries, but they hadn't been operationalized. In the very immediate post-communist period in Central Europe, there was a kernel of a Central European cooperation called the Visegrad Group, where Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland had gotten together and sort of talked about finding some sort of a way in between East and West, a way to cooperate. But that was sort of strangled in its crib, I have to say, because the U.S. and NATO came in, and the EU came in later, throwing around a lot of money and a lot of tales of glory.
So we sucked them, NATO sucked them in, essentially. It seems to me very much like what John Perkins talked about, the modus operandi of the United States, is to get these countries in debt, whatever they need, or whatever they don't need, just get them to buy things, attract them in one way or another to buy the things that we produce, our large corporate interest making out a lot of money, and then we provide the loans for them through the IMF or the World Bank or what have you. Exactly. Okay, so I've recently been reading the work. I started to read a book called Failed Crusade by Stephen Cohen, and he talked about how during the Clinton years is when this move towards NATOizing all these countries really started to kick in high gear. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's right, and Professor Cohen is one of the great experts, and unfortunately he's now demonized because he's been telling the truth for 20-some years.
Yeah.
He's been saying the same thing since way before Putin came in office, but now he's accused of being in the pay of Putin, which is absolutely absurd.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got this problem now in the Ukraine, and if Cohen is right, we've pushed NATO up to the point where Russia really feels threatened at this point in time. Now, I suppose the neocons and Americans, a lot of Americans think, well, they shouldn't, because we are wonderful. We have the greatest thing going in the world, and everybody should be honored to be a part of NATO. Everybody should be honored to be a part of the American exceptionalism. And I'd like to just read a quote from Stephen Cohen in his book. This is at the front of his book, and he talks about perceptions that Americans have of Russians, and he says some of these perceptions had serious consequences, but none so perilous as the official U.S. view, widely shared by journalists, scholars, and others, that since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia has been a nation ready, willing, and able to be transformed into a replica of America. It has contributed to a human tragedy on a massive scale, and for the first time in history, the destabilization of a fully nuclearized country. Wow. I mean, I read that, and I end of quote. I mean, this is really from a man who has a lifetime studying Russia, a scholar at Princeton and NYU, a professor who certainly a mainstream guy, although you say he's being demonized now. But what are your thoughts about that, Daniel? I mean, that we have thought that why would anybody ever question not wanting to be like us, right?
Yeah, and actually, in going even deeper than that, it's more of a philosophical issue because it depends on how you view history. Was the communist period an anomaly, or was it part of a sort of linear trajectory of history? And all of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union as well, the Soviet Union was a victim of, Russia is a victim of communism, just like Hungary, Czechoslovakia at the time, in Poland. They were all victims of communism.
Yes.
And there is, I think, a very legitimate school of thought that views this as a historical anomaly, sort of like a dead zone in your history. So the question is, when that dead zone is gone, what do you do after that? If you build your future on the foundation of that dead zone, you have problems. If you reach straight back to where you were before communism took over, then you're also accused of looking back to the demons of history. So they have a huge identity crisis in Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of communism. And I don't think with few exceptions, any Western scholars understand this deep sort of philosophical crisis. And I think Professor Cohen does understand. I think there are a few who don't. But I think the other Kremlinologist types like Condi Rice and the others, They were too drunk with the idea of victory to contemplate this sort of existential crisis of those who suffered through, in some cases, 70 years of an alien philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, in any event, it seems though the arrogance of the United States, and our leaders at least, if not the people of the United States, I think more the neocons, the military-industrial complex, the people that get rich, and the people that are really in power that really want to believe this American exceptionalism. I mean, I think going back to our history, to the Constitution, I think we certainly were an exceptional country. I think we were an anomaly in history, but a good anomaly. That's my view.
Yes.
But okay, so we've had this arrogance, this idea, and of course you say Condi Rice being drunk with power and wealth and all these things that I think that the ruling elite are afflicted with. So we kept pushing and pushing, and now is it your sense that Putin won't give? There's no way and no reason that he should if he wants to retain the sovereignty of his country, right?
Well, I wonder what giving looks like. You know, that's the other thing that I wonder about, certainly about Obama's foreign policy. And if you look at the recent speech in Brussels, which was riddled with historical errors, it shows that the speechwriters simply had no concept of what happened in the 1990s. You know, forget about 1917. They had no concept of what happened in the 1990s.
Even the 1990s, yeah.
So, for example, you know, this has not been widely reported in the Western media, but Obama simply erred when he claimed that there was a referendum in Kosovo, just like in Crimea, to separate, but it was more legitimate. There was never a referendum in Kosovo. The parliament in Kosovo simply declared its independence, and backed by NATO forces. So just full of basic errors.
Yeah, an excellent article that you wrote, I should mention to our listeners, March 29th, titled "Straight from the Teleprompter." Can't you believe in it? Or I think, yeah. So that what I would recommend, because Daniel points out several errors in fact that President Obama made in a speech that he just recently made. I guess attempting to justify placing the U.S. on a war footing. Do you think we're likely to go to war here with the Ukraine, Daniel?
Well, it is kind of reading tea leaves in a way, but I think my sense is, and it really is just a sense that I have, that I think both sides realize it's time to back down a little bit now. And I think the question is, what will the compromise look like? And I think the Russians have a very specific idea of what they would like to see, which is a federalized Ukraine, where you have a high degree of autonomy to the different regions in Ukraine, and you have the demilitarization of the so-called right sector and all the radical right-wing militia groups, and a few other things. And I think the U.S., from what I've seen so far, they have a proposal where they would like to bring in OSCE monitors to guarantee the safety and free expression of the ethnic Russians. They call them minorities, but in many cases they're the majority in eastern Ukraine. I think, you know, and I believe actually on Sunday night, Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary of State Kerry met to discuss these in detail. So I have a sense that there is some appetite for finding a solution. You know, Obama went to Brussels to get the EU on board with tougher sanctions, and he walked away completely empty-handed. The Germans are absolutely opposed to sanctions. They have no interest in it. You have simply an inability in the EU's part and it's in their self-interest. Why on earth would they want to isolate themselves from a growing market to their east? So you have to give the Germans some credit. They understand economics to a degree. Yeah. You know, but my sense is that both sides understand that things have gone far enough, and I'd say, you know, subjectively, let's hope that they do find some compromise solution.
Yeah, let's hope so. It was just an article I just caught in the Financial Times talked about Total, the large oil and gas company out of France. It had some arrangements, I think, with Lukoil, in Russia to help them with fracking technologies to increase their production and so forth. So it seems to me, and another interesting thing, I think, is the City of London that really doesn't want to lose all that money coming in there from those rich, powerful Russian interests as well. So they're inclined not to want to go along with sanctions as well. I'm wondering if, in the attempt to isolate Putin, if it might not end up being the United States that gets isolated here.
Sure, I think it absolutely is the United States that gets isolated, and Foreign Minister Lavrov from Russia said, this whole idea that if the U.S. somehow doesn't like the policy of a foreign country, it tries to isolate it. It's so outdated, and certainly when it comes to a nuclear world power, the idea that you isolate a country like that, which has nominally, at least in this particular situation, China and even India as its allies. If you look at the UN General Assembly had a vote this past week to condemn Russia's manipulation in Crimea, so-called, and to demand the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And if you look at the countries that voted no or abstained, if you look at it on a map, it's very, very significant. The world is much further divided than the U.S. would like people to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interestingly enough, the other day I was listening to Stephen Cohen on Bloomberg Radio here in New York, and he was asked what would it take to satisfy Putin. And as I remember, Cohen suggested there would be basically two things, and maybe there's a third, but I can't remember one. One would be a new election in the Ukraine, and also to guarantee that NATO would stay out. Those are two things I think that he suggested. If we could, guarantee that to Putin, he would, there would be no need for any military conflict.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, Daniel, I have to ask you this. Watching last evening, George Will being interviewed by Charlie Rose, and Will said that Putin is using Hitler's playbook, and that he's going to go from one country to the next. After Crimea, now he'll take the Ukraine and all the surrounding countries, and so you have George Will, a sort of I think sort of a neocon intellectual that is really saying that. So when you have that sort of a notion, and Will would also think, well, why would Russia not want us to give them NATO? I mean, we're so good to them, we're so wonderful for them. Do you think rational people will prevail here, or will the George Wills, the militants, the neocons get their way in creating more chaos?
Well, I mean, think about George Will. Someone like him, what does he know about anything? He's paid to pontificate on everything from baseball to foreign affairs. He's not an expert. He may be an expert on baseball. I don't know much about it. I'm sure he knows more than I do. But on what basis does this guy have any authority? He's not an historian.
Yeah.
He's paid to pontificate, and he's also paid to propagandize the American population.
Yeah.
If Putin actually had that desire, wouldn't we have seen something up until this point?
Yeah.
You saw several breaking points. You saw when the U.S.-backed government in Georgia attacked Russian peacekeepers. There was a reaction in the part of Russia. But if you look at Russia's behavior under Putin, if anything, it's been extraordinarily restrained in the face of continued provocations and attacks toward ethnic Russians who, by no fault of their own, found themselves outside the borders of Russia after the end of the Soviet Union. For example, people in Latvia has an enormous ethnic Russian population. Some of these people had spent their entire lives living in the Soviet Union as Russians in Latvia, and all of a sudden they're not even allowed to have a passport. They're people without countries.
Yeah.
Look in Transnistria, for example, in outside of Moldova, you have an enormous Russian population who is disenfranchised. So the question is, if you put the shoe on the other foot, how would the U.S. react? If the U.S. had been completely blown apart and you had Americans who, through no fault of their own, became non-citizens outside the borders of the U.S.
Yeah.
And Will can't do that. He can't think that way. He can only think in terms of cliches.
Yeah. Well, that's dangerous because he's a well-spoken man. He looks very respectable. He speaks very well. He's on television all the time. It's the American propaganda machine that's poisoning the minds of Americans. Now, listen to this, Daniel. I just have to read a closing remark here from our friend Ann Williams on LouRockwell.com. There was she really went over the history of of the Ukraine and Russia, and you know, she was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Russia during the days of perestroika. But you know, while Will is demonizing Putin and calling him a Hitler, essentially, Anne, listen to what Anne says. She says, who would have thought in 2001 that the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, would liberate the greatest number of people on the planet? And then she says, say what, you ask? Well, she says, if any reader knows another leader of a major power who instituted a flat tax of 13% or less, a flat tax and thereby liberated his people from the necessity of burdensome record keeping and government tracking, while eliminating households' budgets and grievous costs of accountants, tax lawyers, offshore scams, and sparing everyday life the social cost inherent in a society riven by the divisiveness that comes of progressive taxation, then, dear reader, please do email me that name. End of quote.
No,
and you know. Yeah, you know, Ann, and you know, Daniel. To me, this is why I think what Ron Paul brought to America was so important, because it's not just about economics domestically; it's geopolitically what goes on, and what goes on inside a country says a lot about what you're doing outside, and vice versa. I think, and I really believe that we are destroying America. What happens outside? I mean, Ron talked about the reason they're over here is because we're over there. Makes so much sense if you think about it objectively. So all of this is very, very important, I think. And you know, I don't want to make Putin an angel, because I'm sure he's not. As a former KGB guy, I'm sure he has a lot of blood on his hands. But on the other hand, so does our president, and so does every president that we've had for quite a few years have had a lot of blood on their hands. And so this is, you know, I just hope and pray that things get straightened out here and that cooler heads will prevail. And Daniel, I think what you're doing as part of the Ron Paul Institute is very valuable, because I think it's helping people. We can only hope that Americans will look at the truth here and not just listen to the slogans from the George Wills of this world, but think a little bit and look at what actually happened. Do some research, right? And that's what you're providing, the ability to do that at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. I might just mention to our listeners that Ron Paul wrote an article that's just been posted there, Aid to Ukraine is a Bad Deal for All. Maybe, Daniel, just take a minute or two and just summarize that article.
Well, it's certainly, you know, they take $1 billion from the American taxpayers, although they don't take it out of our pockets. They print it so they hide the pain through inflation. But it certainly we take a hit for it, and it's not going to help the Ukrainians at all. This is money that will go to pay the international bankers who speculated on Ukrainian debt.
Right.
And they will have their very handsome profits. And the same people that have been starving in Ukraine yesterday will be starving tomorrow. The only difference is that Ukraine will have now an enormous amount of debt to the IMF instead of foreign bankers. Yeah. And so the IMF will be able to push them around and tell them what to do.
You talk about taking a chapter from a playbook. I mean, I guess we can go back to what John Perkins talked about in Iran in the early 1950s. The same thing is going on, and actually now the impoverishment of the American people and the bailout of the bankers in 2008, 2009, it just goes on and on and on and on unless people start to put their foot down, unless Americans get mad as hell and aren't going to take it anymore. So, I mean, I guess we don't have to be angry, but we should be a bit angry, I think. I mean, people are justified in being angry about being ripped off. It's righteous indignation. Let's go back to the Constitution, right?
Absolutely. And stop believing the talking heads and the propagandists.
One more thing, Daniel, just because you mentioned it before we went on the air, and that is you had mentioned, I think there's some NSA reforms. Would you care to comment just briefly about that?
Well, this is the bill that they're pushing, Ruppersberger. I forget the House sponsor, but this is a bill that is in opposition to the Sensenbrenner NSA reform bill, which would stop the bulk collection. I think the Sensenbrenner bill leaves a lot to be desired, but it's a step in a much better direction than the bill that's going to go through the House. Mm-hmm. And even Justin Amash, whose amendment last year, if you remember, to stop bulk collection, almost passed and was very good. Is very, very worried about the direction it's taking. And there's a problem when Obama is urging Congress to pass this NSA reform bill, Yeah. It's a joke. I mean, what it will do in a nutshell, it will have the telephone companies in the private sector collect and retain all the information that the NSA had previously retained.
Right.
And it will lower the barrier for the government to access that information.
So it'll be worse.
It'll be worse. It'll make it easier for them to do it.
Yeah. That's the direction. And unless people wake up, it's going to continue on and on and on. But we have to try, Daniel, and you are, and Ron Paul is, and the many people that contribute to the Ron Paul Institute and many other websites. LouRockwell.com is excellent. The Mises.org is excellent. There's lots of people out there. Thankfully, on the internet, the mainstream media doesn't allow these stories to be told to any great extent, but at least we still have the internet. Thank God for that. So, and thank God for you, Daniel, and your work that you're doing, and Ron Paul. Hope to have you back again next week.
Thank you, Jay, so much. You're very kind.